First, I wanted to get into Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez saying, you know, we really should have a 70% tax rate. And, of course, we did. From the 1930s, from 1933 up until the mid-1980s, we had a 74% tax rate. And it was the period of time of the greatest prosperity in the United States. And it was also the period of time when the middle class, uniquely, in fact, if you look at the history of the United States, uniquely, it was a period of time when the middle class, the working class, people making less than back in those days, you know, in those dollars, $50,000 a year, their salaries and wages were actually growing faster than the salaries and wages of the top 1%, you know, and or of CEOs in general. Today, 95% of economic gains go to the top 1% in terms of net worth. The richest 1% in the United States now own more additional income than the bottom 90%. The total net worth of all U.S. households is $94 trillion. If you divided that among all 124 million households, that's $750,000 per household. Well, where's your share? It's being held by some insanely rich person. The wealthiest 1% own 40% of the nation's wealth. The bottom 80% only own 7%. So what do we do about this? I mean, historically, taxes have been the way that we have essentially prevented this from happening. Right now, the 400 wealthiest Americans in America have more wealth than half of Americans combined. On the line with us is Charles Sauer, libertarian economist and president of the Market Institute, author of the new book, Profit Motive, What Drives the Things We Do. Came out yesterday. marketinstitute.org is the website. You can tweet Charles at Charles Sauer, S-A-U-E-R. Charles, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me on, Tom.
Thanks for joining us. So tell me, how can you, and how do other libertarians, for that matter, justify an economic system, you know, progressively lowering taxes that leads to monopoly and oligarchy and stifles the wages of middle-class people? It's killing America. We're seeing lifespan go down for the first time since the 1950s. We're seeing infant mortality go up. We're seeing, you know, poverty increasing, all as a result of this insane tax policy that Ronald Reagan brought us.
Well, the way that we rejoice is that we don't tell history the way that the left does, which is just telling your own false history. First off, if we look at the high tax rates from back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s,
and 60s and 70s,
what we had was nobody actually paying those tax rates. We had a tax system where you could deduct your wife's business travel, not just deduct your own business travel or your own business meals, your own 3-martini lunch. That's what the left wants to not retell when they tell this history. So we rejoice that life is better. The fact that infant mortality is going down, it's going down in the U.S. because we're actually quantifying it at a lower...
Infant mortality is going up in red states.
Infant mortality is going up, but it's because we're actually keeping track at a younger age.
And Charles, you know, this is a complete red herring to say that back in the 70s I could deduct my 3-martini lunch and any expenses, you know, business expenses that my wife incurred. I don't think that's unreasonable, A, but B, that has nothing to do with how somebody who's making hundreds of millions of dollars a year, tens of millions of dollars a year, is you know, what they're doing with that money, or how they're basically taking it out of the mouths of working people. The simple fact of the matter is, back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and early 80s, CEOs made on average 30 times what their employees make. Right now, CEOs make on average 560 times what their employees make, and there's only one reason for that, and that is the change in the tax laws starting in the 1980s.
It doesn't, but the quality of life is increasing. Those same people
not for working
maybe
people.
Couldn't afford a car then, and they might be able to afford a car now. And cars would be more affordable without the high regulations in place. Maybe they weren't able to get a TV, but guess what? TVs are now owned by everybody. If we look at poverty rates today, people have multiple telephones, multiple TVs, multiple cars. This is in a different world. Comparing those numbers is a retelling of history that doesn't make any sense.
Charles, a $200 TV is such a small piece of a family's household, 4 or 5 year budget, because a TV lasts 4 or 5 years typically, that to say that somebody's not poor because they own a TV is a slap, at the cost of what, $16, $18, $20 a year? I mean, that's an absolute slap in their face. I mean, I'm astonished that you would even use that kind of bizarre argument.
Those words. You're putting those words in my mouth. The words I used was increased quality of life. I'm saying that poor
I'm not talking about quality of life. I'm talking about wealth.
No, you were the one that just put words in my mouth. The fact
You're
is
trying to change the conversation away from who owns everything to, well, gee, poor people have a decent quality of life because they have a phone and a TV. That's a nonsense argument. If you're broke, if you're in debt, you've got a $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. You've got families who are making less money now than they were back in the 1960s. I mean, even the minimum wage is below what it was in the 1960s. It's about half of what it was in the 1960s if you inflation adjust it. I don't see what any of that has to do with the ability of a poor family to own a television.
I'm saying it increases their quality of life. You get more information and
poor.
More understanding of what's going on. You understand how to pull yourself up out of poverty. And the fact is if you look at the research, the left has pushed enough federal laws that you can't live in. You can be poor, but you can't live in what's under the federal poverty level under today's circumstances if you're willing to get the programs that are out there.
Okay, so Charles, I get it, that you're fine with the situation as it is right now, and in fact, maybe you would like working people to have even less money, but and very, very wealthy people to have even more. But you never answered my original question, which is what's wrong with going back to the tax rate that we had from the 1930s to the 1980s, which was literally the singular period of the greatest prosperity of this country for pretty much everybody except the top 1%, and certainly for working people in the United States. What's wrong with going back to that kind of tax policy?
Well, I actually slipped it in and didn't think that you were going to take the bait, but you took it. The problem with it is that politically, to get that, you have to exempt so many things. And what we now have is a very progressive tax system, but it's a flatter tax. We have less deductions that people can take.
Wait a minute, are you saying that in order to get something
travel, you can't deduct business meals?
You're saying that we can't have a high tax rate which suppresses the top 1% basically from stealing all the wealth in the country. We can't have that because the top 1% owns so many Republicans they won't allow it to happen. In other words, it's not politically feasible. That's a pathetic argument for saying why it shouldn't happen.
No, I'm saying that all economists understand that that tax system is a bad thing. If you tax the wealthy at that rate, they're either not going to work or they're going to hide their money.
That's great. To hell with them. If they hide their money, the IRS will track them down and take it. And if they don't want to work, I don't want them here.
That is a fabrication of history. When the tax rate was, 91, 94%, people weren't paying that. The highest people were paying were like 66%, 45%, and that was still a ridiculous number. But that was what they were paying on their income on the marginal dollar. That wasn't even their overall tax rate. So if you start off with a made-up conversation, you can corner me into a made-up conclusion.
Okay, Charles, I get it. Here's the guy. This is Sean the 360 here. Here's the guy who raised the top tax rate from 25% to 91%.
On the one hand, there has been a vast majority of citizens who believe that the benefits of democracy should be extended and who are willing to pay their fair share to extend them. And on the other hand, there has been a small but powerful group which has fought the extension of these benefits because it did not want to pay a fair share of their costs.
He's saying basically the same stuff that Alexandria Ocasio said. In fact, here's another one.
Taxes, after all, are the dues that we pay for the privilege of membership in an organized society. And as society becomes more civilized, government, national and state and local, is called on to assume more obligations to its citizens. The privileges of membership in a civilized society have vastly increased in modern times. But I am afraid we have many who still do not recognize their advantages and want to avoid paying their dues.
Why is it that guys on your side, Charles, never even engage in this conversation?
Well, first off, let's just think back. I like hearing actual oratory, hearing somebody actually sell something. But that doesn't mean that he's not selling a bill of goods. That doesn't mean that he's not framing the conversation
more prosperity
in a
than this country's
ridiculous
ever
way.
had.
No, that was created on the books. The fact is that what he's saying there is, I'm spending money on the credit card so fast that you all need to spend more money, and I am going to define what
Charles,
is
when
fair
Reagan
and
came
what is
into
not.
office, the
That's a
national debt
ridiculous
wasn't even
thing.
$1 trillion. When Reagan came into office, the national debt was only $800 billion. Reagan tripled it, starting the two Santa Claus strategy. I get that, but you can't say that he was spending money on the national credit card. That's not what was happening.
Our economy.
Him and Eisenhower
he just said
stimulated
that.
the economy.
Government is increasing and becoming more expensive. The fair share is rising. He said that in the speech.
Yeah.
You can't retell it minute to minute. The fact is what is going on here is that we had decimated the rest of the world. Of course, we were growing. We had all of this innovation that was happening. Our economy was booming. Right now, we're in an actual fight, a hand fight with the rest of the world on who's going to grow the economy.
Because we blew up Roosevelt's policies. We embraced neoliberalism.
Those policies were slowing down innovation. We now have more innovation in the private sector, and we're winning.
Okay, Charles Sauer, a libertarian economist and president of the Market Institute. His new book, Profit Motive, What Drives the Things We Do. MarketInstitute.org. Tweet him at Charles Sauer, S-A-U-E-R. Charles, thanks for dropping by.
Thank you, Tom.
Good talking with you. We'll be back. It's 18 minutes past the hour.